Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I'm reacting to a video by J Warner Wallace, and his son Jimmy, I believe, is also credited on the channel, that was released less than a week ago on his channel. The video is entitled, "Were the Gospel Writers Present During the Time of Jesus?" This is where he discusses whether or not the Gospel writers were close to the time of Jesus enough to write an accurate account of his life. For those of you not familiar, J Warner Wallace is a former cold case detective who claims that he used his knowledge to deduce that Christianity was accurate. But as the Prophet of Zod broke, I don't know, a few months, a year ago, there's no way that Wallace was a cold case detective at the time of his conversion. At best, he was working on cold cases just as an officer of the law. But he still pushes the idea that it is his expertise is what leads him to believe the Gospels are historically accurate. But let him introduce the topic and get started, shall we?
And that's the first test for the Gospels, it seems to me. We have to find out, are the Gospels written early enough so that the people who say they wrote them could actually have been there to see what they say they saw? Make sense?
Yeah, that is the issue, which is the claim that the Gospels were written by people who were eyewitnesses of the events in question, or at least associated with people who were. Now, there are a number of problems with eyewitness testimony, which Wallace knows very well, but the closer to the events a person writes, the better. And what he is trying to say is that the Gospel writers were there, or knew people who were there, when they wrote the Gospels. But let's see what proof he offers.
So here we have the ministry of Jesus, 30 to 33 AD, and we have the first place that the church comes together and says, okay, these are the reliable eyewitness accounts you guys can trust. That's not the Council of Nicaea, that's the Council of Laodicea. Not until 363 AD does anybody say, these are the Gospels we can trust. What could have happened between those 330 years? A lot of time. What if the Gospels were actually written late, like much closer to the time of the council than they were to the time of the event? You shouldn't trust them, because that means they're written by people who weren't even present at the time of the actual events. If that's the case, if they're written late, you can just chuck that stuff. I would not trust a witness who came to me, who was born in 1975 and tried to tell me about a crime that occurred in 1970. You couldn't call her a witness. That's the problem.
I'm not sure I would have put it that way. Their goal was to provide an authoritative canon, and by the time of many of the church councils they did this, the members of the church had attached names of people such as the apostles to these gospels, and supposed close associates apostles to the gospels to give them more authority. So the problem is much deeper as we look at it critically. Once Christianity became the official religion of the empire, a lot of this kind of thing was going on, including the searching for relics of the faith and establishing the canon of Scripture, and it took many councils to do the last one. But he is establishing the issue. There is a large gap of time to bridge to prove that eyewitnesses wrote them.
On the other hand, if we can figure out that these were written earlier, closer to the time of Jesus' actual life, we can at least know that the first criteria has been met. Could they still be lying? Yes. But at least we would know they're lying at the time of the actual event. That'll help us. So we're going to take a look at this right now. How do we know when these were written? When were the Gospels written? Well, I was moved when I read through the Gospels. I'm looking for pieces of circumstantial evidence to build a circumstantial case.
Yes, and I want to state out the gate that prosecutors use circumstantial evidence to convict people all the time, as it can be just as valuable as direct evidence in court. But the key is that it has to be connected to direct facts that have been established or evidence, and has to have a high degree of probability to the point to show that it is the most probable inference that can be made. In other words, it has to connect to established facts. It has to be the most likely explanation to be admitted as evidence.
It seems to me what's missing in the Gospels, for example, is any description of the destruction of the temple. It'd be wise to include it seems to me, because Jesus is going to talk about it, he's going to predict the destruction in Matthew 23. Why wouldn't you include the actual destruction of the temple? It's going to happen in 70 AD when the Roman army comes in and sieges. As a matter of fact, the siege of the city is also missing. They laid siege around the city about 2 or 3 years before the actual destruction of the temple. It'd be a great opportunity for Peter, when he's talking in 1 Peter about suffering, to reference the siege of Jerusalem, where they starved out and eventually collapsed the walls and destroyed the temple. What a great place to talk about suffering. Why is there no mention of the siege?
Interesting, but that's not the way a critical scholar would look at it. The statement that could be made is that there is a mention of the destruction of the temple, which is in these predictions in all the Gospels, and that because of that, most critical scholars place the writings of almost all the Gospels after the destruction of the temple. There are a lot of Gospels written before Mark which contain no prediction of the destruction of the temple, but then again, they were not canonized by the church. Mark is the first one chronologically who adds this element, I believe. Wallace is trying to say predictions are not the same as mentions of the destruction of the temple, and critical scholars, however, make no distinction, as the possibility of adding it after the fact is a real possibility. I could understand very much how the destruction of the temple would not be mentioned at all as well, because it would undermine the credibility of the prediction, as one could say the gospel writers made it up after the fact to make it look like Jesus was a prophet. I mean, if you include the fulfillment of the prophecy, it's definitely written after the prophecy was made and the fulfillment. You could easily say it was added in post, and not before. But more importantly, the destruction of the temple as an essential element of what the writers were trying to do, which is to collect and put the orders of the stories of Jesus. They're not trying to include all of the history of the early church and the world around us. What they included and didn't is a matter of their choices, not necessarily what they knew or didn't know. They were trying to present the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus at the time. Jesus could be just very much a lie or a misrepresentation, or they were mistaken about this. After all, they are collecting oral traditions, and perhaps after the destruction of the temple, an oral tradition arose about the fact that Jesus predicted it, and when they wrote their Gospels, they included it. There's a couple of alternative possibilities of why this could be the case.
Anywhere in Scripture. Why is there a mention of Paul's death? Why is he still alive at the book of Acts when it ends? He dies around 64, 67. He's martyred in Rome. Why not mention his martyrdom? I mean, you mentioned Stephen's martyrdom in the book of Acts. You mentioned the martyrdom of James, the brother of John. Paul's a pretty big figure in the book of Acts. Why don't you mention his death?
Okay, so we're including the book of Acts in this. Yeah, okay. But it makes perfect sense as to why the Gospels would not have this, as Paul doesn't seem to be around in the narrative of Jesus' life anyway. Yeah, I'm well aware that the conservative theory is that the writer of Acts ends with what he knows. But that is not an established fact. That's purely conjecture, and he could have ended there purely as a choice to end his narrative at that point. He could have run out of paper, etc. Remember, circumstantial cases require some connection to establish fact, and that they must have the most probable explanation. Not including the martyrdom of Paul is neither. It's an argument from silence, and there are many explanations as to why this is the case, including simply it was the author's choice to end at that point. Once you go beyond that, you're engaged in conjecture as to what the motives of the author are.
Why don't you mention Peter's death? Why don't you mention James, the brother of Jesus? He dies in 61. The three biggest players in the book of Acts, and you don't describe their death? Why not?
Because it wasn't essential to the story they were trying to tell, because they are writing about the life of Jesus and the history of the early church, and these martyrdoms were not essential to the telling of the story. Also, on the flip side, because the accounts of these martyrdoms are also controversial and lack historical proof for them, it is not possible that these lack of mentions might be counter evidence to these martyrs taking place at all. Argument from silent is inherently highly speculative. It certainly doesn't connect the conjecture to established fact and points out a multitude of possibilities that have varying degrees of probability. This in no way builds a circumstantial case that could be used in a court of law.
Do you know why, right? Because the books of Acts was written before. The book of Acts is written before all these things actually occurred.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Note that he's trying to use the rules of circumstantial evidence here, but there are two problems: that the martyrdoms are facts he is trying to connect this argument to, and those martyrdoms are not established facts in themselves. But he's also delving into speculation as to why the author ends where he did, and why they included what they included, and he has no evidence that this is the most reasonable inference to draw, as I can draw many others. Like, the author of Acts simply ended where he did because that is as far as he wanted to chronicle for his readers, or that these martyrs didn't actually happen, or the writer of Acts didn't know about them. There are many other inferences that could be made with just as much probability as Wallace's.
That's the most reasonable inference from the evidence, is that Luke is writing sometime before these events had occurred. Now, I'm going to be conservative. I'll put it right here at 60. We don't know how much earlier he actually wrote it, but 60 is fair at least, because it would at least get James is not mentioned. He has 61, so we'll go 1 year before that just to be safe. But we also know that Luke tells us he writes 2 books. What's he write before the book of Acts? The Gospel of Luke. Now we got to predate the Gospel of Luke. That's going to come sometime before the book of Acts. How much earlier? I put it at 53. Why? Because of a couple pieces of internal evidence. First of all, we see that he tells us in the book of Acts, in the first chapter, that he writes something prior to this. And he mentions someone named Theophilus. He'll also mention that name in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. So that's the book he's writing prior to this. I think it's fair to assess that way, to examine it that way.
While it is fair to say that Luke is written before Acts and the 2 books are connected, he is dating Acts on a shaky inference at this point. There are, as I've said, many other alternatives. If I get rid of this inference, then I can date the writing at any time, and the 2 books could have just been written right after one another and at a later date.
But look at what Paul does here in a letter to Timothy, called 1 Timothy. He writes this letter around 63, 64. I'll be honest with you, there are some biblical skeptics who don't even want to attribute this letter to Paul. They'll say this letter to Timothy is not a genuine Pauline letter. I think it is, but there are skeptics. I'll just give you that so you have a fair warning.
And having done my thesis on 1 Timothy, I can tell you that there are good reasons that those scholars give for that. Most notably that the style of writing is very different, and the theology shifts from apocalyptic till resurrection could happen at any moment to establishing a lasting church. I'm glad he included that many scholars say that at this point this letter is not genuinely Pauline, but then he's going to overlook that thing completely and thus make this another fact he's trying to connect to his circumstantial case when it isn't an established fact at all.
But here's what Paul writes to Timothy. He says, look, I love this when I first read it because as a detective, I'm trying to figure out what would the New Testament people call Scripture? Are they just referring to the Old Testament? Is there any internal evidence that tells me what the canon is very early in history? Look at what Paul says, though. He says to Timothy, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are well worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, oh, that's great. Thanks for saying that, Paul, because now I'm going to figure out, you're about to tell me what you think Scripture is. Because I want to know. And he says, 2 quotes. Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. Where's that from? Deuteronomy, Old Testament. Then he says, well, I mentioned 2 pieces of Scripture. He says the worker deserves his wages. Where does that come from? Well, that's not an Old Testament passage. That's a New Testament passage from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. So he's quoting Luke's gospel as early as 63 AD and calling it Scripture to somebody who should know if it is or isn't. Now, what's great about that is it appears that it'll be out there longer, right? It's probably been around for a while longer than that. That's why Timothy recognizes it as Scripture. But how much earlier has it been out there?
Okay, well, you are running with the assumption that 1 Timothy was written by Paul. You completely skip over the possibility that it might not be. And this is one of the pieces of evidence that says it probably was written later based on what we know about the date of Luke, which you have also assumed. You're building assumption on assumption at this point, not a circumstantial case. The point is the quote indicates the possible later date of writing of Luke could well have been written after 70 AD itself. If the death of Paul is before that date, then 1 Timothy is possibly a 2nd century forgery, and this is part of the evidence that this is the case, this very quote. There's really good alternative with a high probability to encounter what you're saying your circumstantial case says, and your circumstantial case is unraveling with anyone with any knowledge of the biblical text.
Well, I look at another book that no skeptic doubts came from Paul. Even Bart Ehrman, the famous biblical skeptic, would agree that this is a genuine Pauline document, and unfortunately it's much earlier than 1 Timothy. It's at 53 to 57, where Paul is going to describe the Lord's Supper. And when he describes it, I first read it, I thought, that's interesting, because every gospel writer describes the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is in every single gospel. But only one writer describes it the way that Paul does, saying that when Jesus did it, he said, drink this in remembrance of me. Well, where does that come from? Got any guesses? He is quoting Luke in chapter 22. So he's referring to Luke twice in his writing, and in one of these, he's writing as early as 53 to 57, and I think he's referencing the exact same thing that Luke is referencing. There's good reason to believe that Luke's gospel then has to predate this, and I would just put it, I won't predate it too much, I'll just put it at the exact same date. How's that, 53? Just to be safe. I think that's reasonable. Now,
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Or the writer of Luke had a copy of Paul's letter and simply copies that part as one of his sources. Perhaps it is one of his sources. You're really avoiding a lot of alternatives at this point. The fact is the writer of Luke could have known about Paul's letter and used it as one of his sources for the event as he recounts it. All this was prove is that the writer of Luke knows about the writings of Paul. Oh, and you're not being safe at this point as you built your whole house on conjecture upon conjecture case that a court of law would recognize as such. The whole line of reasoning starts with an argument from silence about the temple not being mentioned and goes downhill from there in trying to establish the argument with some non-established facts about the martyrs in the first place, questionable authorship of certain books, as you simply take as authentic. There is not a circumstantial case at this point, but it is base speculation that would get an objection in a court of law at this point, as any good attorney would point out the flaws in the reasoning at this point as well, and that almost all the things that you're trying to use as facts are hearsay evidence.
I remember when I first started examining the Gospels, I was struck by the claims of Mark. Who the heck is Mark? He's not an eyewitness. Why is he writing a Gospel? Well, in the first century, a church leader named Papias wrote that Mark was chronicling the teaching of Peter. And Papias wrote that he wasn't trying to be all that careful about order. He was really trying to be more careful about accuracy.
Yeah, the problem with Papias is he openly states his bias in his writings, that he is not trying to be factually accurate, but be an apologist for his faith. He pretty much then states he rejects anything that didn't line up with what he felt was authentic and relied almost entirely on hearsay evidence of eyewitnesses, of those who, quote-unquote, heard the words of the apostles and what they said. This is a very flawed way of doing research, as you're taking what that person says as factual without verification from other sources. You're also, how do we know that these people actually were connected with the apostles? He never really goes into that. His opinions about why Mark is writing are just that then, his opinion.
So it's not an orderly account, it's an accurate account, according to Papias in the first century. That was interesting to me because Luke, when he writes his gospel, he starts it off by saying that many have undertaken to drop an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke's not an eyewitness, he's a historian. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. That's interesting. If you're writing an historical account, wouldn't I assume it's orderly? I think that Luke here is quite possibly referring to the disorderly account of Mark. His is now an orderly account. Who does he quote, by the way, more than anyone else in his gospel? Mark. So I have to place Mark ahead of Luke.
Yeah, the synoptics are like that, and Matthew and Luke copy Mark almost verbatim for a good chunk of their contents. It's not a great leap to say that Mark writes first. The question is when he writes. It's an eyewitness testimony problem, as Wallace would well know, indicating that witnesses collaborated with each other when in investigation. Detectives try to avoid this by keeping the witnesses separate. The problem is the gospel writers have a lot of time to get their story straight, so to speak. Wallace would know this is a problem, but let's see if he mentions it.
I'm not going to place him a lot ahead of Luke, but a little bit, and that puts us very easily within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. The early dating of the Gospels, I think, is actually the best inference from the circumstantial evidence.
What?
No, it's not, because this isn't circumstantial evidence. There are many alternative explanations, which also have good probability, that are not addressed in this presentation, and I think that's by choice. When your chain of your case has, one, a non-acknowledgement that the destruction predictions could be references after the fact to the destruction of the temple and could be written after the fact, that the martyrdom stories have less historical backing than the Gospels themselves, and that is saying something. and that Luke could be using Paul as a source for the Last Supper, indicating a later writing for Luke, that you are using the book of Paul that may not be his, and many more things. This is no longer a circumstantial case hinged on the facts, trying to show a most probability event based on facts, but it's an opinion based on a preconceived bias. You're presenting one option of many that also have a good probability as well throughout this entire presentation.
And if it's early, there are problems for those who are skeptical, because you've got to say to yourself, well, did it change over time? And it doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's written at least at the time that an eyewitness would have written it. By the way, why didn't they write it right away? Why did they wait 12, 15 years to write it? I'm thinking, why didn't they take notes and stick that thing on Facebook right away? That's what I would have done. Well, because I think that the apostles genuinely thought that Jesus would come back in their lifetime.
Yeah, that seems to be true of Paul's verified writings, but more importantly, and you're overlooking this, is that you have not established who these gospel writers are. You have assumed it throughout your entire presentation. No evidence has been given that Mark wrote Mark, etc. It's been an assumption and one given without evidence. Even if I were to grant your explanation, which I don't, in truth, this does not establish anything other than it is possible that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, and that is all that it would prove. That's not a circumstantial case's objective. It has to be a lot more than that in order to possibly be a circumstantial case or offer circumstantial evidence, and you know that.
And if that's the case, there's not much need, aside from orally. Let's get the information out quickly, because he's going to be back any day now. And then if they see people like Stephen and James being martyred, the brother of John, you start to see Gospels appear. Now it's time to start writing stuff down. We're not sure when he's coming back. Present, I think we can ask that. I have an entire 25, 30 minutes we could do just on verification, internal and external. So I'm just going to have to, we'll say it's in the book, but I love this aspect of using outside sources, internal corroboration of language and government and all kinds of references that the scriptures make.
But if I take some of the things you said as true, Paul does not change the narrative that Jesus would soon return after the supposed deaths of Stephen and James, John's brother. That narrative only changes actually after the death of Paul and the church becomes more established. You're kind of misrepresenting the history of the church there. This whole narrative doesn't change after the deaths of Stephen and James. It changes after the death of Paul. Not to mention the book of Acts is one shot, no corroboration from anything in history, wonder. Something else Wallace fails to mention in building his case. Wallace ends, of course, with, go read my book. Some off-the-cuff comments about this video. I have a lot of problems with J Warner Wallace because he knows full well, if he were to analyze it analytically, that the eyewitness testimony presented in the gospel, the supposed eyewitness testimony, is so hearsay, okay? And he knows that. It doesn't even meet the exception criteria for hearsay, and he knows that as well. He has to, and he's ignoring it. The fact is, you don't have the authorship stated inside of any of the books. John doesn't say, the Gospel of John doesn't say John wrote it, for instance, and that's true of all four of the Gospels. He doesn't really, Wallace doesn't really point that fact out. And the fact that every single story in each gospel, there's no source for those either. This makes the gospel straight up hearsay. Okay, and the book of Acts is even worse because you have no corroboration from anything outside of the book of Acts. And he's tried to use these established facts as proof of his facts. There's a lot of circular reasoning here of proving the Bible with the Bible. And he's trying to go on the idea of internal evidence and, that there's good internal evidence that, these things are true. But the problem with internal evidence is you're making a lot of assumptions as well. You have to really assume that Christianity is true in order to make the case that he's making. But even if I were to grant everything that Wallace says, all that gets you is people writing about Jesus very, very early. Okay, fine, I'll grant that. Doesn't change the fact that their sources are unknown, which means we don't know if we actually have eyewitnesses or just a bunch of stories around the campfire for 20 years, which has its own problems, which he also knows. he should know how fast that urban legends can come about. You can have stories about certain events crop up almost immediately. I've often used the example that in my own Pentecostal churches, miracle stories had a tendency to grow and get out of hand very quickly and become more than what they were. And this is certainly very much a real possibility for the case for the Gospels and Jesus. I think his biggest misdirection in this video is the destruction of the temple narrative. He doesn't mention the fact that critical scholars looked at the predictions of these of the temple's destruction and the details in them and go, yeah, that's probably written after the fact. Because he hasn't proven that prophecy, the supernatural nature of prophecy, even exists. Apologists always skip that part when they talk about prophecy, and they don't always address the obvious implications of something like that being included, which is that means the date of the writing of the Gospels is later. The prediction elements of the temple are actually what causes many critical scholars to think that the Gospels are written after 70 AD, including Mark. You need to remember that the people that want to believe this stuff always go with the earlier dating, but the people that don't have an axe to grind one way or the other always seem to go with a later dating. Okay, and that's because what you're dealing with is the church gets past its first generation and it's realizing it's establishing itself and it's trying to build its credibility. And so, yeah, a lot of gospels are starting to be written. But there were tons of gospels, and the church councils didn't deal with that until way late in the 4th century. And I would argue that he's kind of wrong there. I think the Council of Rome is the first time that you really see them canonize Scripture, and then they do it again and again and again for many councils because there's still an argument about it. And so, I don't know. As usual, Wallace kind of disappoints me. I kind of feel like he's a little bit oily because he's misrepresented his conversion story for many years without batting an eye. He builds his case. It seems like it's a business to him now, and the fact that Jimmy is coming along, with it, it's kind of, I don't know. He gives me that used car salesman vibe, I guess, and that's kind of my emotional reaction to this. But honestly, I've heard this argument before, but if you're going to build a circumstantial case, you got to build it on established facts. Jesus' predictions of the temple destruction, the argument of silence that, he didn't include the destruction, none of these writers include the destruction of the temple, none of these writers include the martyrdoms. These are all arguments from silence, which by its very nature is highly speculative, especially if there's lots of alternative explanations. I just didn't feel, this is typical of apologists. They direct the conversation down a single avenue, and he creates this chain of events and things he talks about without ever really going into the real critical thing. Now, he mentions like 1 Timothy isn't, considered authentic by a lot of people, but he doesn't say why, okay? And part of the why is the quote from Luke, okay? And, if we're dating Luke later, it makes it so dependent on the dating of Luke. And there is a very probabilistic alternative explanation, which is Luke knew about Paul's writing and used him as a source, which means Luke is written after Paul was alive. And that's actually one of the good evidences that that is the case. So there's a lot of different ways that this is going to be looked at. Wallace tries to channel it down, and this is the most, reasonable inference that I can draw. And I'm like, well, your facts that you're connecting this to aren't exactly facts established. Your testimony is hearsay most of the time. I honestly believe that the case for the Gospels would be laughed out of court, okay, because it would be like, if you could can we prove the life of Jesus with the Gospels? And any good lawyer would say, no, this is all hearsay. We don't have that who these are written by, and each individual account of each event in them has no source either. So we don't know when this could be written. And then you're left with textual criticism, which only kind of takes you to the very late 1st century. So anything could have been written from that point on, but you don't have any proof that anything was written earlier than that. So that's kind of where you're left. I don't know. I wasn't convinced. cold case detective or not, he doesn't seem to give me the vibe of, yeah, this is real proof for Jesus. So I guess we'll leave it there. Well, thanks once again for stopping by. I'd be interested in your thoughts in the comments. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. This is my 500th video posted to this channel, so there's another milestone achieved in this last week, along with the 5K subscribers. Thank you very much. If you want to support the channel, my PayPal link is in the description. There's also, super chat, super thanks. Always appreciate those. And of course, the best way to support the channel is membership. The membership is growing, so thank you very much for all of you who become members and all of you that have paid to have people become members. I appreciate that. Thank you so very much. But I also want to give a shout out to my members, to my citizens, to my rabid citizens who become Legion, that I need 2 pages now, and to my tribunes. Thank you very much for your support. You allow me to focus more on videos for the content you love and enjoy, and less on appeasing the YouTube algorithm. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So take all your time, money, and opportunities and use them to build up yourself, the relationships, and the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.